Jesse's on.
Yeah. Is everyone here?
Nobody's on yet.
Just us. Okay.
The horizon that's still and the boat that's moving. But when you're doing VR, you're the one that's still and the horizon is moving. So you feel kind of like really wonky.
Yeah, and it's also the technology. It's things like this isn't that interesting, but things like latency in the head. It's like milliseconds difference between the way your brain naturally processes like movement is different than the headset can't process as quickly as your brain naturally can. So it creates this weird kind of sense of nausea. Hopefully with the mixed reality, it's not so much the case because you can see the world around you. Although we do kind of have to.
I was going to say, when you're doing narrative stuff in VR, how do you direct the VR's attention or the person who's wearing the headset? How do you direct their attention to whatever the next narrative earmarker is going to be?
I mean, this is something that Danis also talk about as well. Yeah, I mean, that's something that's kind of always, I mean, sound, the sense of presence that is kind of the main thing that you're trying to create when you're kind of in this VR space. And I feel like sound is really, really important to that. And actually sometimes in virtual spaces, the graphics can actually be a little distracting. But Danis and I had these conversations as well, because we worked together on her project, The Hunt. And it's kind of like, how do you kind of have people look at the geese that are flying in the direction when it's like, without being like, hey, look at those things flying over there. And it's and then it's also like, you have to be okay with kind of almost like layering on the narrative, because it's like sometimes you don't want to be, sometimes like if you're going through, someone's gonna, if you think about like that Sleep No More play that was in New York, I'm not sure if you've heard about it, but it's like, if you kind of walk through this house, it's like you can have a different experience than that person that you came with, depending on where you're going. And that it can really be something you can go through twice and have a completely different experience. And be okay with that as a director. It's not like everything is going to be, that not everything you want them to see is always going to be seen by them.
Yeah, it was interesting when we worked on The Hunt, because in film, you ask yourself a lot of questions about where on the spectrum of subtlety you want to be, you know, like what is too subtle that your audience won't understand, and then what is too obvious so that it's like on the nose or it feels really unsophisticated. And I felt like applying those questions to a VR space was interesting, because the audience, it can really look anywhere. And if you want to direct attention, I felt like things like directional sound were helpful, because I was like, how do you do this without making it so unsubtle? And I kept cracking this joke that it's like, look over yonder where the crow caws, caw-caw, caw-caw. So that the person would then turn and look, and it just seemed all so silly. So anyway, I have no idea whether or not it worked out, but we certainly had fun experimenting with how to direct attention.
And that's kind of, I think, like part of the reason why I love like interactive stuff is you're really kind of figuring this stuff out. It kind of feels to me a little about kind of the way I felt about movies when I was first making them in like high school, and like figuring out how to edit and how to like set up the lighting and all of these things. It was like, you know, you kind of are figuring out the rules. And then with mixed reality, it's like there are some, and it's interesting talking with different people like game developers, and they've kind of developed different languages about how you can kind of like build trust in a virtual partner or things like that. But it's like borrowing different language from different mediums, and seeing what works is kind of the part of the fun.
I'm wondering, since all three of you have worked or at least dabbled in the VR space, Nyla is very much embedded in there, in that the various realities at play. Given we're now, of the moment we're now in as a global community with the pandemic and what this has meant, do you think that will advance or further the growth of those sorts of multiple realities? Because let's face it, we may be limited in how we can experience reality in the world going forward. Like, we may not be able to travel in the same way or gather in the same way. I wonder, from the three of you, do you imagine that sort of technology might be able to fill some of those gaps or provide that connection that it hasn't yet, but that maybe this moment shows us the potential better?
Well, I think, like, one thing I think is that people like to kind of be able to, if you can have a project that can, and actually, Jeff, I remember a tweet from years ago, you said something like, something about wanting to make a movie into a TV show, into something, but it's like, you know, it's important to kind of have this idea that, you know, you kind of live in this space. And for me anyway, I like the idea of being able to kind of sit in this world that I'm kind of living in and think about it in different ways, and kind of the different, so whether, like, because if you kind of take this story and kind of look at it from a comic book perspective, it's going to be a very different kind of thing. But it's another kind of way to explore this space. Or for me, it's like this community of Pang, where I'm just happen to be doing a lot of work, and that's where my nephews are from. It's just like, it's just kind of convenient to have this like place that I can kind of center things around. But then it's like I can like explore different kind of things within that. And I certainly think that these kind of new technologies, I mean, Jeff mentioned, they're really kind of early in their evolution, but
oh yeah, we're in the rock and chisel phase of VR, I think.
Yeah, but
I think we're in the rock and chisel phase of VR.
But you can like hang out in virtual spaces in real time and hang out with people's avatars, and it's, you know, you can kind of replicate a sense of closeness in a way.
Yeah, and that would be like,
I mean, what we're talking about is kind of like.
Danis, why don't you go, and then Jeff?
Okay, sure. Like, I think you could imagine a thing like, in times like this, when are we ever going to be able to go to a concert again, let's say? And so would there be a world in which, you know, and Nyla, you know more about this world than me, so like maybe this already happens, but there's a live event where everyone puts on their headsets and they're all virtually watching the performance, like imagining that the whole crowd and everyone that's in there is all in the same space. And I don't know, it's interesting. Like, my son is on video games 24/7, and it's not VR, like right now. And it's not VR, but I can definitely say that he puts on his headphones and goes into the game, and all of his friends are online. So it is literally the only way he socializes right now. And on one level, I'm like, well, he needs social connection, and that's important. So he has that and does that. And at the same time, like, I know that there can be a wonky feeling when you've been in the, you know, thing for too long, that you try to come back into the real world and you kind of like, there's a sense of disassociation. So I don't know, like I guess I kind of worry about what it does to our current reality, as well as appreciating that there's probably, you know, opportunities that
You know what's
take
funny?
us into interesting.
Jeff?
I find I get that same feeling writing. If I write 6 hours and I come out of it, everything looks like it's made out of plastic or it's been replaced by like the exact replica. So nothing feels quite real.
And it's literally because you're in.
And I was going to say,
head.
yeah, and that's like 90% of the way I spend my time. So I'm always like that, where I go for walks and I'm completely in my brain, and I know exactly what you're talking about. You turn on a video game, you turn it off, and 12 hours have gone by, and it goes by like that. But I feel like the technology that we're talking about is kind of like Ready Player One, where that feels like it's 50 years down the road, and it might even not be something that we experience. And I think, you know, until they invent smell-o-vision, I mean, you're still going to have some sort of, you know, you're still going to have some sort of layer between yourself and reality. And the weird thing is too, I don't like projecting any kind of realism, in the sense that I'm Native, and I don't want people to think that the individuals that I show in my projects are representative of all Native people, rather than just one adjunct of a particular story. And I think that's one of the things that you have to deal with. So anything reality, virtual or otherwise, I have a tendency to shy away from, because I like tackling Native ideas. I don't necessarily like tackling Native representation, if that makes any sense. And I get the impression that if you're in a virtual environment and you're experiencing things, it would almost be as if you're saying this is the way it actually is, but really it's still going to be an augmented section of whatever that slice of the story is.
And I think you bring up just a good point, kind of like from an ethical standpoint, is like when you're a 2D movie is very passive. You're showing something, and with a VR experience, you're actually kind of giving the viewer like a character and a perspective, and the viewer has to ask the question like, who am I in this world? And that's a lot of responsibility. I think something that probably Indigenous people or people of color think about much more than non-Indigenous creators of this stuff. Which just goes to your earlier point of like responsibility. And
I find that distinction you made, Jeff, between Indigenous or Mi'kmaq or First Nations or Métis or Inuit ideas versus representation, and that they're distinct from one another. And I can't help, you know, my film historian brain, you know, I can't help but think that this is a quandary that we have inherited because of the historical relationship between moving image and our peoples, and the fact that, you know, at the very dawn of the moving image, there was a representational issue. You know, when Edison made those shorts in upstate New York, there was a difference in the reality of them, in terms of them being a performance, versus how they were ultimately consumed and positioned in the broader space. And it feels like there's still a representational disconnect that exists, both in terms of art that's made about us, but even within our own sort of what we imagine our representation would actually look like when we got the chance to make films. And that there still might be a disconnect between now that more and more of making movies, making TV shows, making video games, or multi-reality projects, that there's still a quandary there. There's still a disconnect between the representation and the reality and the ideas that underpin those things.
The weirdest thing about that is you expect it from a non-Native audience that's been conditioned to look at Native people a certain way. The weird side effect is that it seems to have spilled over to Native people too, who kind of who almost entertained the notion that the sacred Indian is a real thing, opposed to this, you know, white liberal cipher, the white guilt or whatever the fuck it is. Like, who even knows?
Yeah, I think
So that's another thing that you're constantly dealing with as a Native filmmaker. Like, what if your values as a Native Mi'kmaq man do not adhere to those public values you had fuck all to do with establishing? Like, what do you do then?
Yeah, it's really, I think it is a quandary because, you know, like when there's been such a lack of representation, it creates this like desperate vacuum, you know, where like nothing has been. And so I feel like representation, and even the word, comes with a great deal of expectation of just like, oh my God, we got, you know, because it's been gotten wrong time and time again. And to say that we are like have fatigue about it is an understatement. Like, it's enraging, the lack of not just lack of representation, but the misrepresentation and the way that we've been portrayed for, you know, over 100 years of film. And so, you know, to step into that vacuum is inevitably a fraught thing. And I think it's fraught for us as filmmakers that are bringing our own baggage to that, but also for audiences. And I think especially our own communities, it comes with an expectation that is challenging to meet, I think. And you know, I think we always just like again, the distinction that you made, Jeff, about ideas, like there's something about even the word ideas that like connotates a certain amount of freedom. And I think that it's that artistic freedom that is held in such high sacred regard by sort of like the cultural institutions of our country that uphold that value. And by the way, that artistic freedom, you know, on the part of white people has also, you know, like very much promoted a white supremacist agenda. And so all of a sudden we come into this space and it's like, you know, to imagine even having, I mean, first off, I don't think the artistic freedom that we're looking for is one that, you know, like forwards a white supremacist agenda, but certainly it feels like trying to imagine a greater amount of freedom with what if we could just look at our work under, you know, the umbrella of ideas, like that would feel more free, you know. And I think representation is a useful lens because we have to talk about the way we've been portrayed in order to move forward. But, you know, like certainly I feel like a hunger, both as someone who creates things and as an audience member. And sometimes I wonder when that will feel quenched. And I don't know the answer to that.
Never.
But well, I think all you can do is be true to your own stories, right? And that's all we can do.
Nothing like annoys somebody. I don't think nothing annoys people more than a fucking Indigenous man who's not going to apologize to you. That's the vibe I'm getting. Because that's I always feel like every other day I need to apologize to somebody for something I did that I didn't know I did, or I didn't know was a thing. And I feel like the whole fucking scene is wrought with landmines and virtual signaling and all this shit that no sane human being would be able to meet. Like you'd have to dedicate your entire life and still you'd get things wrong. And it's overwhelming and exhausting and it's depressing and it's working on me. I don't know about you guys, but it's getting to the point where I'm getting a little fed up with it.
Well, I think of the challenge is always that, especially with, you know, social media, that that can amplify both critique and grievance and all at the same time, and can sometimes make it hard to differentiate between those two things, because there is, of course, valid critique of all work that we should all take, and like that is a thing we should listen to. And then there's a bunch of stuff that isn't, but it can be very difficult in the moment to parse. It strikes me. I had this conversation once with Guillermo del Toro, was another filmmaker, and because we were talking about, he's a Mexican. Sorry?
We've heard of him.
Yeah. In case some people may not have, but look him up. He's a little-known independent filmmaker, and he's Mexican. Another shocker for people that don't know that. But we were just discussing art and sort of the role of art, and how the expectations that audiences put on art. And he gave me what I thought was really wise advice, which he just said, not every story can contain every answer or every element. Like the story is just that story. It may only have that window onto a given issue or problem or people or that perspective. And that if you want, to get the full picture, you may have to make many, many, many works. And you may never even accomplish that. And that isn't necessarily even the goal of art. But that the idea is that in your window, be as true to that window as you possibly can. And I think that, there's a lot of expectations and obligations that I think Indigenous peoples bring into everything that we do that does require us and can seem like more effort than other folks in the exact same practice are having to put in. And some of that is really valuable because we're trying to do this in an Indigenous way, and this is required it. And some of it, I think, to speak to what you're saying, Jeff, is conditioning that we ourselves have to unpack, that we're not free of it either. And that we have to be able to unpack when we're asking people to do things that we wouldn't necessarily require of others, even when we want to behave and be in different ways than we have been taught or have been conditioned or that others do.
I think it's a pretty. No, go ahead.
Oh, okay. I was once at this lab with Deepa Mehta, and I asked her a question about, does she get worried about the criticism that she's, that people could accuse her of, portraying stereotypical representations of her own community. And I said, what would you say to those people? And she said, I would say, fuck you, because it's honest. Which I thought was an awesome answer, of course. But at the same time, like one of the things that I find important, like when I'm making my own work, is notions of accountability and responsibility back to our own communities are really important to me because those are values. And I always feel like I hope that my work is driven by something that has to do with values, because I love my communities and I'm doing this for them first. And I think, and it doesn't mean that everyone has to like it or approve of it, but it just means that I hold it close, because in the hierarchy of audiences that work has been made for, in my mind, our people are not at the top of the list that work gets made for. And so for me, it's not like I, try to get caught up in, what people would like or wouldn't like, but in my heart of hearts, I'm making it for them first, and I won't apologize for that. And it means that if it has reference points or specificity or whatever, it's like, or I even try to pepper things in that hopefully my community will pick up on, so that they can feel like they own it too. Like I want it to land with them and feel like they respond by saying, yes, this is a piece of this is mine. And of course, I think it's unrealistic to ever expect that everyone is going to feel that way. But the notions of accountability and responsibility, because so much work has been done about us that has been frankly completely irresponsible. It's something I can't get away from, So it's like there's this tension between freedom and accountability that's always there in every question that's being asked about the work. For me personally, anyway.
I actually just got accused of making films for white audiences. That's actually why I'm so pissed. And I thought about that as it's been bugging me for the past, since I heard it. And I'm like, Joseph's named after my grandfather. Moon is named after my uncle. Gisigu is named after a friend of the family. We shot in Kanawage. We shot in Lestabush. There's specific things there that only the community would see. Like, I have no fucking idea how much more representative I could get of where I came from than what I've done. There's literally a character in there that speaks only Mi'kmaq. Like, it's like, what the fuck what do you guys want from me? Like, is everybody supposed to be running around with bows and arrows and feathers in their hair? What's going on? Like, I've been doing this for about 23 years. I started doing hardcore representative stuff. Like, we were working in communities doing language documentaries. That's how I started for the first 3 years. And then I started doing short films. And then in the entire 20 years, I've never been really kind of told by anybody outside of my community that I'm representing Native people well. The arguments that I get is that, oh, the drunks are in there, the without explanation, like all that shit. And it's what I experienced growing up. Like, if I showed you the Guemat family album from my res, every other fucking picture would have a beer in it. And that's what I grew up around. And I'm sorry that offends people, but like, I don't do drum and feather Indians. And that's because I've never really experienced that. I experienced blue collar guys that spoke Mi'kmaq, iron workers, Marines, carpenters, miners, all this stuff. And that's where I come from. Like the Turtle Island sacred speak stuff is a fucking foreign to me. And my brain jumps out of my ears when I hear people talking like that. And I don't know how to accommodate those people. And the awful thing about it is I do want to accommodate them because they're a part of the community. And I don't want to feel like I've left anybody behind because I know so much how that, like what that feels like. And it becomes like you're getting torn apart. And in the meanwhile, you're getting these projects with fucking 6-7 figures attached to them as a payday, and you're turning it down because it doesn't represent who you are and where you're from. And you start and wonder why the fuck am I doing this? Like, to what end? If at the end of the day, the people you're doing it for, or the people you perceive you're doing it for, don't really seem to give a shit. So that's where I'm at in my head right now. So.
No, and I think that is totally fair. And I think that that it is from our own communities, there is more pressure, and because there is a lack of representation, there's a lot of pressure. Like, even for me, and you're gonna hate this, but like when I first started watching Blood Quantum, there was like a sense of relief for me because I was like, oh, like, thank God this is good. Like, because it was because there's a lot of pressure being put, like, we're kind of advocating for real money to get to like real money that, like, similar to sets on non-Indigenous productions. And it's like, you know, we want to show that, we're saying to them, give us the money and we can show you, we can make good stuff. And so it's like, so then, you know, I actually am like fighting to get a budget to go and make a movie up. It takes a lot to go and film up in Nunavut to get a crew up there. And so I'm like, you know, I'm asking for this. And then I'm like, but it comes with like, well, you better, you know, you got to show that it's like, you know, that if you're saying give us the money, we can do it just as well. And then it's like, you kind of, there's this pressure to do it just as well. And so they're like watching Blood Quantum, it was just like, it was just like, for me, a bit of sense of relief, but for you, I can't imagine the pressure. And I think when what Danis is saying, like, yes, when it comes down to it, we're making movies that we want our communities to feel proud of. And so when we're getting this kind of lateral violence, it just hurts even more, because it's like, don't you see where this is, that it actually just to get to the point where you could be making a movie with that kind of budget, the kind of advocacy you had to be doing, and people like Danis and Jesse had to be doing in this community around you to get there. was a lot, and you had to fight for your values and your kind of idea and your representation to even get to make something like this. And so to kind of get this like backlash like that is just, I mean, it's a lot.
The weird thing is too, like, you know, if Joe Lunchcan fucks up the movie about the white guy, they don't blame all the other white guys. Like, all right, white guys don't get to make films anymore. But if Blood Quantum fucked up, it's like we just gave this goddamn Indian $5 million and he just pissed it away doing this bullshit movie, and then Danis doesn't get her cut, and then like the guys coming up behind us they don't get the same money, and it's just like the onus of not only the fucking industry to expect you to knock it out of the park, and your own community to knock it out of the park is like you're getting crushed, man. And sometimes you don't get turned into a diamond, you just get dusted. and that's where I'm getting pulled between that, and it's overwhelming and exhausting. And really all I want to do is move on to the next project, because that's always what I've wanted to do. It's just move on to the next project. Done, move on to the next project. Done, move on to the next project. Like, just let them exist as films and not become the spokesperson for every little detail in the film. And that's what the film is for. So I'm kind of like, I'm overwhelmed by it. And I think anybody out there looking to get into the native film industry need to be aware of the amount of shit they're gonna have to deal with every time they try to get a project off the ground.
Jeff, I feel like I'm so appreciative that we're having this talk with so much honesty, because that pressure is really real. And I think, yeah, for sure. Like right now, I feel like I'm in this like little cocoon where my film hasn't come out yet. And so it's like I haven't had to face kind of like whatever the response is going to be, and that industry pressure is real, because the wave of, you know, films at the feature level and a higher budget level is really just starting to come up. So, like this wave that we're experiencing right now is also like a guinea pig like wave, like what we're going to be like the litmus tests for a lot of things. And that comes with a lot.
Yeah, the canary in the mine.
Yeah, totally. It's so true. And it does come off the years of off of years of advocacy on the part of many people that fought for us to have our right to tell our own stories. And sometimes it is, the fatigue is really real. And I think it's so important for us to talk about care in this process, like care. It
really is.
And care for ourselves, because we power through these situations without taking stock of what the cost is. And I've been thinking about some other filmmakers, because the CSAs just happened this week, and it's like Maya Tail Feathers, won for Best Direction, which was so amazing to see, and Tasha Hubbard won Best Documentary, and Jennifer Podemsky won for her show as well. And I know like how, because I know these people and they're all a part of our community, it's like I know the cost that they have had to bear personally to see these projects come to fruition, like how many battles, and actually that the making of these projects can sometimes come with their own trauma. And it's like we don't want to overinflate our roles as storytellers to say like, there was someone shot dead this week by police, or not shot dead, he was like, killed by police down in Minnesota. And it's like, you don't want to overinflate the importance of it, but like to talk about that toll is really important, because I want all of us to keep telling these stories for a really long time to come. And I feel like we have to talk about care for one another and what we do, and care for each other in the process, like to just say, hey man, like I got your back. I hear that it hurts, it's painful, it sucks, and we care about your work and what you made, just for the record.
Yeah, same here, Jeff. I want to thank all of you for your comments, and I just wanted to say a couple things. I mean, on Danis's last point, You know, we have seen a pretty horrific week this week. What the Anishinaabe, Jeff, will call Turtle Island. I know the Mi'kmaq have another name for it, but it's been a hard week this week, seeing our Black cousins in so much pain and ongoing pain. And while we don't want to overstate the importance of filmmakers and TV makers and storytellers, we should take note that a culture that produces police shows ad nauseum, where the police are centered and get to be fully human characters in a way most of the people that they chase on those shows do not. That in a culture that makes movies and TV shows about policing more than virtually any other subject, that there is a correlation between that and the violence that we see the police perpetrate on communities of color all across this land. And I think we actually, while we don't want to overstate the importance, we shouldn't understate those connections, and that those are very real things. And while representation won't solve those things, it won't hurt either. And that maybe we need less cop shows and more shows about the people that the cops are killing and arresting. And maybe that would actually help change some opinion. And on the idea of the success, I mean, I think you guys touched on it so beautifully. The pressure that so many First Nations, Métis, and Inuit folks have when they enter any industry, because they are so often alone or one of a few. And as we're accessing more budgets, higher budgets, which we've all been advocating for years, it brings more pressure. But I want you and everyone watching to know that when I advocate for it, one of the things I advocate for is to allow us to fail too. That as much as I want to talk about the success that our community will have when we have access to the same level of opportunity, I think it's important that we also mark that for other communities that have had that access, they've also had the freedom to fail and do it again. It doesn't mean that they're out once they do one failure. And in fact, one could argue that the Canadian media industry is as built on failure as it is on success. And Indigenous folks should have the same room to succeed and fail on our own merits, and not have that be the one and done scenario that so often happens. And it's frustrating because not only does it hit us on the successful side, on like, if you make a bad movie, that's it. Even when our community makes brilliant movies, I flash back to when Zach made Adenarjuat in 2000 and 2001. And the thought by so many of us, because it was a huge box office hit, was, oh, they're going to greenlight a whole bunch of Inuit or First Nations movies now. They didn't greenlight one after that. And that's after a success. And so we need the opportunity to both succeed and fail in the exact same way as other communities, and for that pressure to be lifted, because we're not all of us have to be Babe Ruth, because that is not what is demanded of the other players in this game. And I think that we should make space for that as much as for everything else. And I realized that we were supposed to talk about the apocalypse. But I think this was a very
Which one?
Useful discussion to have, in despite of the apocalypse. But I'm wondering if I can just get an apocalyptic question into all three of you at the end. Do you think, I love to say that Indigenous peoples are already post-apocalyptic peoples. We've already seen our way of life destroyed, and we have lived through it. Do you think we have a particular vantage point on which to view what is happening globally and how we might tell this story differently than others?
It's weird that you mention it, because I'm working on I was working on this other thing, and then the plague happened, and I was taken aback by how willing the Western culture was to run headlong into danger. Like I felt like we were at the whim of a fucking death cult, to be honest. I still do feel like we're at the, like, I feel like we're pushing, this culture is pushing the entire thing towards the brink of extinction. Like, even before the plague, you had you had what's basically turning into an environmental apocalypse, and it feels like it's only a matter of time. And I imagine this world where the spiritual natives are a part of an old, cosmic horror cult that actually bring about the apocalypse to help these white people to speed it up. That's the story I'm working on right now. So I felt like exactly what you said, they're doing it because they're kind of like the themes in Blood Quantum. There's nobody better equipped to deal with it already. So it's like, we've survived one, we could survive the next one. And it's just a matter of interpreting that, right? And for me, I interpret things, zombies, werewolves, vampires. And in this case, it's going to be a cosmic horror thing with tentacles coming out of a vortex in the sky. And it's weird because there's all that history with Lovecraft and his use of, native legends. And it's kind of speaking to the, overall native trope in horror and the overall, bent of this culture towards the brink of extinction. And I've lost sight of what any of it means anymore, because we're dealing with a culture and a society that doesn't seem to fucking care beyond their own political wiles. And I'm like, I'm not sure how to process that anymore as a sane human being. I feel like I tweeted this morning, we're in a simulation, right? It's all going awry. Like there's some COVID monkeys that escaped, and there's a comet that fucking buzzed the planet. There's like literally a spaceship could land in downtown Montreal, and I wouldn't be surprised at this point. Like, that's what
Jeff makes a very good point here, which is his movie is about to come true, and I'm struck by that Nyla and Danis have also made somewhat, portraits of the future that might cause some unease. So I'm wondering, for both of you, how soon will your movies be coming true?
There are parts of my movie that have already come true, because I like to think of things as like the cycles, right? Because I think it takes many centuries. For some reason, it takes many centuries for human beings to learn any lessons about anything. So the question of our times, I think, is, how long is capitalism really expected to survive? And I don't know if we'll see the end of it in our lifetime, but I certainly wonder what would come after that. And for me, I like, as far as like the apocalypse and notions of how we're supposed to be in this world, and especially if things get worse instead of better, which at the time I wrote my film, I was really hoping they wouldn't get worse, but I started writing it, I guess, about like 6 or 7 years ago. So it was in the like Obama years. So Donald Trump was nowhere on the scene. And I remember feeling like, the demographics in North America are changing. They're becoming less white, and there's going to be a white backlash. Like, that's what I feel. And so I wrote a realistic timeline, like, that is mapped out from the year that I started writing my film, going 35 years into the future. And I literally, this is who wins this election. This is what happens as a result. Like, I just wrote a political timeline. And like, to my horror, some of the stuff like happened way quicker than my imaginary timeline, like the election of Trump. And like, who would have imagined such an insane and horrific villain? Like, none of us could have written that, because it would have been way over the top. But, like, I go back to, and I think, what Night Raiders touches on, and that's the feature that I'm working on right now, that is like dominated my existence for years at this point. But Jesse, I think you have this t-shirt, but we see it often in our communities, and it's the t-shirt that says, "My existence is resistance." And I feel like for Indigenous people, like, we just have to exist, because our very existence is an affront to the settler state that has come in to colonize all of North America, which we were in the way of. And so I feel like we're always seeing Indigenous people on the front lines of resistant movements in real life. When Standing Rock happened, that was happening. The central question of Standing Rock was really around like how we want to treat the earth. And it was like a climate justice movement. And, the environmental movement is much bigger than Indigenous people. And yet these environmental justice front lines happen on Indigenous territories, with Indigenous people literally putting their bodies on the front lines. And I feel like, if there's one thing that we know how to do, it's how to resist. And I think at times like this, we are going to need it. We're going to need to know strategies, because if this state continues as it is, and we have leaders like Trump and like, Boris and like and down in Brazil, like we're going into crazy town. And it's like, we better pull up our bootstraps. And I think it behooves us all, not just Indigenous people, to really think about, how we actually mount, some kind of defense against where our world is going.
Here. Nyla, I'm afraid to ask, are the aliens already here?
Yeah, I mean, this kind of goes back to like Jeff's comment about kind of when I was talking about alien invasions and this kind of colonial threat, but actually also kind of making this movie in the community of Pang, where my nephews are from, and my youngest nephew having, when he was younger, tuberculosis, which is, something that is supposed to be eradicated in the Western world, but in small pockets of the Arctic, including Pang, tuberculosis is still kind of a thing. And it almost meant us not being able to kind of film in that community, because I take immunosuppressants myself. So, it's like this, even before a colonial threat, Inuit just kind of living in a ridiculously harsh environment to begin with. You mentioned Zach Kunuk, and he had something that he used to say, which is, we don't believe, we fear. And it really is our kind of myths and legends that are all kind of wrapped up in this, in our traditional belief system, really are kind of built on this idea of fear. And also, so a lot of our children's stories, like all children's stories, are cautionary tales, and so ours are just incredibly terrifying. And I think that kind of horror and storytelling, but also humor, is a big part of how we kind of deal with that. And I think that that's kind of something that, I think of my friend Zoe Hopkins, our friend Zoe Hopkins, and her kind of comedy and filmmaking in these times is like, kind of like, I see it as like a similar ally to this kind of genre and horror, in kind of processing all of this stuff.
So we have a couple questions from the folks watching. So let's ask this. What practices are you implementing on your sets to deter lateral violence or sexual harassment? Have any of you utilized an intimacy coordinator during pre-production?
You fuck with the women on set, you deal with me. That's the deterrent. that's deterrent for anything on my set, to be honest. So I don't think that's been an issue. Not to mention, there's pretty stringent rules in place with the unions. So anybody who gets harassed on sets can report it to their unions, and the unions can handle it. And they usually do an investigation that lasts a few months, and people could get fined. They could lose they can lose their union membership. I mean, there's things in place already that, I don't know exactly what it's like on your set, but I know on mine that wasn't tolerated even remotely. So I think it's, you know, it's not something that I personally had to deal with, to be honest, that I know of. Like the pain in the ass in my sets are typically, you know, rambunctious actors, not sexual harassment. So I've never had to deal with it. I don't know about you guys.
No, I think it's my understanding that an intimacy coordinator is someone who deals specifically like when it has to do with like sex scenes. But I could be wrong about that. I mean,
No, actually, you're right. You're right. We've had something like that. We've had intimacy coordinators on one of my shorts way back in the strip scene in Rhymes. So, you know, I mean, that is, but that's what I mean. Union reps are on set to make sure nobody's, you know, being mistreated. And we did a strip scene for the Colony with Dio Horn. We emptied the set. There was just me and the DOP, and that's it. And I was like, not even in the room. I was watching from the monitor, and you know, I take that pretty seriously. So I wouldn't even know, because I've never had to deal with it. I don't know if it's but I've had pretty diverse sets. Like we've had people from all walks of life and from all ethnicities and all sexualities and all gender IDs. So I mean, it's really the set you promote. Really, that's where it starts. It starts there. And if you as a director respect people, and you'll be respected. And more to the point, if the boss is being respectful of people, then everybody else will respect. So I think that's really it. And I don't really, you know, I've never really experienced anything like that, and I hope I never do. So that's been a non-issue on my sets.
For me, it was important to try and there is I feel like a bit of a gender imbalance sometimes in the technical positions in crew. I found that true in the tech world as well. So that was something that was, when we were hiring, we were trying to kind of be mindful of that. And then also just because capacity building and mentorship as part of like the built into kind of the project was important to me, just because not a lot of movies get made of this budget in Nunavut, and then of that kind being directed by an Inuk. I mean, there's not a lot of opportunity for people to get the kind of experience that maybe they would if they lived in Toronto. So kind of building into each department had a position for an Inuk to be trained, and that's like a paid position for the duration of the shoot, and then just kind of, you know, trying to hire locally as much as possible with transferable skills was just kind of something that we built in.
Another question from the viewers: how do all three of you see the pandemic influencing Indigenous storytelling in all forms? What about in comparison to the way it influenced many of our ancestors' storytelling throughout history's past cases of flu and pandemics in our nations?
So you have 2 minutes left. We're not going to cover it in that 2 minutes. I know, speaking to me personally, when the pandemic broke in February, I completely changed what I was writing. I scrapped it, and I'm like, given the existential dread a pandemic brings to the public zeitgeist and consciousness, I felt like what I was writing didn't really carry water anymore. So I needed to switch it to integrate, you know, what was going on. And I just, you know, I switched it. It was originally a film that was set in, or a story that was set in the present tense. And I kicked it ahead like 20, 30 years and acted as if the pandemic never went away. Because I got some news for people up there. The last thing they cured, or the last thing they found a virus for, was probably HPV. And that was around for about, you know, 60, 70 years. So don't hold your breath to anybody. This ain't going away anytime soon, if at all. Because another fun fact, never ever in the history of our race have we ever found a vaccine for coronavirus. So I think the idea that this is going away anytime soon is pretty preposterous unless there's some sort of miracle cure around the corner. So the first thing I did was I integrated it within my story, and like everything I do, it's speculative. So you just kick it ahead a few years into the future and reapply everything.
Yeah, I think, I mean, certainly we've seen like pandemics hit our communities before, and way worse than COVID. So like, again, this idea of cycles of history. My dad's a Cree historian, and he's been writing a lot about how the smallpox epidemic just like hit us hard, and that was really brought over by settlers, and then Indigenous people didn't have immunity, and it was a horrible disease. And for my dad's home community in Saskatchewan, it wiped out 90% of that community. So when we think about, like COVID and how horrific it is definitely put a damper on things, but we have experienced way worse in some ways in Indigenous communities that was directly related to colonization. So like, to me, there actually is an element that is a reference point to smallpox in my film, and I had no idea it would reference something new that before the film was even released.
My wife too, who's Navajo, as you know, switched her story to include, because there's this prophecy about how the world is going to end. This is a Navajo prophecy about how the world is going to end when all the Navajos meet again. And right before the COVID thing hit, they just all met again. So she's integrating that into her doc, which was supposed to be about, the Danis spread across, North America, South America, and the Arctic, because that's the biggest. Correct me if I'm wrong, but the Danis are the biggest populace of natives, right? Am I wrong? Because it's the biggest reserve in the U.S. So she changed the narrative too, but to integrate legends that came from the past and reapplied it to now. And I think that's the interesting thing about being human and being native in particular, is that I think you're forced to see these patterns a lot more because of the situation we're in. And I think the misnomer too, New York being the biggest epicenter of COVID in the US is not true. It's Navajo country. So I don't think it's going to affect natives per se, but I think filmmakers coming out of communities that are specifically hit are going to have definitive stories, either about the events that happen, or they're going to transpose them to a fictional world. But the end result is the same, and that it's an extension of colonial values and practices. That's not even up for debate, man.
What do you think, Nyla?
Sorry, just so distracted. What was your question about?
Never mind then. We should wrap up. So why doesn't everyone plug whatever it is you want to plug? I know Jeff's got a movie out now, so we'll start with him. Jeff, where can people find Blood Quantum?
On all your download and rental platforms, Apple, PS4. It's not been on Shudder yet in Canada, oddly enough. And in the US, UK, it's going to be on Shudder. I think it's on Amazon Prime too, which is, I think, Shudder is a subsidiary of Amazon Prime. So it's everywhere. And there's I just got a hint that maybe a TV show that I wrote while I was finishing Blood Quantum is maybe getting picked up, and the cosmic horror thing that I'm doing now, and I'm in the middle of doing Sarah's Navajo thing too. So I'm busy for a guy who's like for a time where nobody's working. I'm exceptionally busy.
Danis, what would you like to plug besides your beautiful children?
Oh yeah, sorry, this is my niece, and she is so cute. Anyway, yes, family's all in the house. My film Night Raiders, which is the near future feature that imagines that children are property of the state and that we're in a post-Civil War North America about 25 years from now. So I've been working on this. We shot it last fall before everything hit the fan, and COVID has slowed us down somewhat. So we were originally hoping for this fall, and now I feel like I can say that if we're able to get a couple more things done, we should be done by the end of the year.
Nyla?
Yeah, I'm kind of in the same boat as Danis. Flashback, but probably end of the year. Was hoping for fall. But who knows now? Yeah, and we don't have a Twitter or anything. We've got an Instagram account. Flashback, I think, is what it is.
So, folks, it's been already as much as going wrong in the world. This week has been a banner year for First Nations, Métis, and Inuit storytellers at the Canadian Screen Awards, winning more awards than our community ever has before. And this year, we're already on our way to topping it next year. So go see Blood Quantum wherever you can find movies. And later this year, be on the lookout. Don't worry, we will tell you all about where to find these movies when they're ready. Be on the lookout for Night Raiders and Slashback from the Indigenous Screen Office. Miigwech to Danis, Jeff, and Nyla. And miigwech to all of you for joining us. And we'll see you again very soon.
Thanks, Jesse.
Well,